Hi, my name is Sally Hadden, and I'm a professor of history at Western Michigan University, and I'm the author of Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas.
Well, thank you for joining us. And we are discussing your book, Slave Patrols. So I always start the interview with just kind of a general question. What led you to research this, and what did you find most fascinating about your research?
I was reading books about law and violence when I sort of stumbled across this topic. I had read R.R. Palmer's book on police force in London, the beginning of the Metropolitan Police Force. Otherwise, we think of them as bobbies or the peelers. And at the same time, I had picked up a copy of Edward Ayers's book, Vengeance and Justice, which was about crime and punishment across racial lines in the 19th century South. And I was struck by a paragraph in Ayers's book where he said, you know, there were these slave patrols and their work was to do X, Y, and Z. And I thought, I don't remember ever reading about them in any other source. I had just come out of a seminar where I had done a tremendous amount of reading on the history of American slavery. And I thought, I don't recall reading about these. Maybe did I just miss it? So I went back to all of the books that had been assigned in that seminar. And then I started pulling other books off the shelf. And before I knew it, what I found was I kept reading the same paragraph. I kept reading the same little short description that everybody had cribbed from everybody else, but there was no full-blown description of who these people were, where they came from, what they did, why they existed, anything. And so I became interested in the topic because of a gap. I identified a gap that existed in the scholarly literature, and that's what kind of drew me in. Solve the mystery.
Well, you absolutely did. The book is really still, I believe, one of the most authoritative sources, if not the book on slave patrols that's out there. And so thank you for your work. It's an amazing accomplishment. And I'd like to kind of begin formal discussion of slave patrols by kind of, if you could walk us through how they came to America out of the Caribbean, and you touch on the Barbados systems. So maybe you could.
Sure. We don't know where the earliest slave patrols first appeared. The best work that I was able to do suggested that they originated on Spanish colonial holdings where the Spanish Empire had colonies in the 1500s. And I was able to identify that there were groups like the Hermandad or Rancheadores that existed in these Spanish Empire colonies, and their job, they were tasked with controlling enslaved people. And roughly a little bit later, 50 years, 100 years later, the English begin settling various colonies of their own in the Caribbean, and they run into the same kinds of problems. Their expectation, their hope, of course, as white lawmakers is that slaves are going to be perfectly well behaved and they'll never rebel and they'll never do anything awful. And of course, everybody loves freedom. And so who wouldn't rebel and who wouldn't try to run away to gain freedom? And so the English lawmakers in places like Barbados and Antigua, Barbuda, so forth, look around and they see that the Spanish have these groups that are tasked with controlling slaves. And so they begin to implement the same sorts of laws in the 1600s in English colonies to adjust their militia groups to have patrol elements, patrol work attached to what the militia are supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that leads me to the second question I kind of had as you were talking, is this differentiation between militias and patrols. Maybe you could speak a little bit on that.
Sure. Militias are the source. They are the origin for where patrols come from. But in fairly short order, they become distinct from patrols. The militia goes back to the Middle Ages. They are a group that we can track back into the English world before the year 1200. There are militia groups that exist, and their purpose was pretty straightforward. They were to provide military backup whenever the kingdom was threatened. And so a county leader could summon the militia together, and they could be sent off to fight pirates or the French or whomever was needed. And they would typically be called up and would serve for a very short period of time, maybe no longer than 3 months, and then they would go home. And so the militia are basically farmers. They're people who till the land and who get pulled off the job for military purposes based on what the government needs in a short-term basis. They're not a standing army, and they're not trained like a standing army. You might think of the militia as the gang that can't shoot straight. These are folks who maybe they go hunting on the weekend, maybe they go fishing on the weekend, but these are people who are farmers. And so the militia migrates to the New World with settlers. It's what they know from Europe, and so they bring it with them as a means to provide military protection when the army's not around. When the professional army or navy is called away to go do something, what they have for self-protection is the militia. So in the 1600s, in English-speaking colonies, places like Barbados, the government, when it starts thinking about how it's going to cope with the threat posed by enslaved people, and at the same time the threat posed by perhaps invasion by an enemy, is they have to have a militia that can do two things. It has to be able to repel external threats, whether that be pirates or the Spanish or whomever, but it also has to be in a position to control internal threats like insurrections threatened by enslaved people. And so they begin adding laws on to redefine what the militia is supposed to do and give it additional tasks. Well, the problem with that is that the militia already has a lot of work to do. If you're called away from home for 3 months to go fight the pirates or fight whomever, what are you doing about the enslaved people who might be left back where your home is? And so in North America, when the idea of the militia and the patrol comes to North America in places like South Carolina, the South Carolina lawmakers decide, hey, we need to break this up. We need to divide this group into two different bunches so we can mobilize the militia and maybe send it away, send it off to the coastline or off to fight Native Americans, which is the big threat that they face a lot of the time, while we leave some people behind as slave patrols to keep an eye on enslaved people who are still back where the home folks are. So the militia and the patrol gradually begin to separate and develop as two separate entities. But at least in South Carolina and in Virginia, in the early periods, the patrollers were drawn out of the militia ranks. And that has some impacts for things like how old these people are and what they look like. The militia ranks are typically people who are 16 to 45, free white men. Typically, they're landowners, not always, but they're at least taxpayers. And so patrollers are going to be a subset drawn from that same kind of crew.
Well, and also, I kind of wanted to transition into what the patrol was tasked with doing, because I think I was surprised to learn some of what their duties were and how they managed the population, the enslaved population. So we can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Slave patrols had a number of different tasks. One of the biggest tasks that they had to do was to effectively ride along the roads, through the paths, through the forest areas, places where people traveled. And the idea was that patrollers were supposed to inspect the physical passes, the written pass that an individual slave might be carrying that gave them permission to go from point A to point B. We sometimes don't realize that enslaved people were sometimes, occasionally, depended on the master, permitted to travel to different places. They might be traveling to see family. They might be going to a religious meeting. The reasons are multiple, and they might be running an errand for a slave master. And so to make it valid for them to travel, they were given a pass, and the pass literally gave a destination and a date. It said this person has permission to go from here to there on thus and such a date. And so what slave patrols, one of their very first jobs was to inspect a pass pass of any enslaved person who they came into contact with. And the idea being that they would read the pass, they would know whether the person is where they're supposed to be or not. And if they're not where they're supposed to be, then they can basically capture that individual and return them to the slave plantation where they're supposed to belong. So that's the first and the most obvious kind of job that slave patrollers had. Another job that they had was to enter the slave cabins of places where enslaved people lived and worked and slept. And the idea there was that they were looking for people who were missing. They're looking for goods that have been stolen. They're looking for weapons. They're looking for people who are there who aren't supposed to be there. In other words, they're basically looking to see, has anything changed in this place since the last time we were here that should not have changed? If somebody's missing, well, you might know they died, or somebody might be missing. That means they're a runaway. And so the patrollers are supposed to go into slave cabins, and they could do this without a warrant. Patrols never needed warrants to enter any building that they wanted to go into. And this included the homes, the buildings that were owned by white people. It wasn't just that they had the ability to do warrantless entries into the homes of African or African-American individuals. They could do warrantless entries into any building because that was part of the way the law defined their work. So a second thing that they did, aside from checking passes and going out on the roads at night, was to go into the homes of African-American enslaved individuals. And the third biggest thing they might do is they might do what we would think of today as modern surveillance, the stakeout. They could, if they had a suspicion that an individual was trading, let's say, liquor in return for stolen goods, they might stake out that location and wait for enslaved people to be drawn there to trade goods in exchange for liquor. Typically, enslaved people were not given liquor except maybe once a year by their owners. And so, if you like the taste of booze, you might figure out a way that you want to get some when you're not supposed to have it. And patrollers might be there waiting, kind of like the spider in the web, doing the surveillance on a place that they think is likely to be a magnet to attract enslaved people. And another job, just one last thing, is that I've been describing these individuals, slave patrollers, as rural people. That is to say, they went to farms, they went to plantations, and so on. But slave patrols existed in cities as well. And so they also were out patrolling the streets at night. They were making the rounds. They were going to places where they thought enslaved people might congregate. This includes places where they might be drawn together by religion. Enslaved people frequently wanted to gather to celebrate religious ceremonies without white eyes observing them. And so patrollers were specifically told that they should try to break up any gatherings of slaves that were more than, say, 3 to 5 people, say a family, an immediate family. And religious gatherings were another target of the kind of work that patrollers did.
Yeah, that's a great overview of what they did. And I think if we move now into kind of who they were as far as in the population, because I think the assumption is that they were all lower class or poor whites. And you kind of make an argument for that not to be the case.
Yeah, for a long time, the literature about American slavery, when it discussed slave patrols at all, the sort of common unsubstantiated assumption that was built into the literature was that, well, these patrols must be people who are, say lower class, working class, that they are people who they need the money, therefore they're doing the job because they'll get paid, that it wouldn't be people who have any money at all. And what I was able to determine based on the information I got in the archives about the members of different patrol groups is that that's not entirely accurate. That in fact, what you see is that typically there are slave owners on every patrol, that there are people there who have enough wealth that they own some slaves, in fact, sometimes many slaves, and that they are part of the patrol group. And if you think about it for a little while, you can begin to understand why local white landowners would not want to have a slave patrol made up entirely of folks who don't own slaves. Slave patrols have the ability to use violence. Not just the ability, but they do use violence against enslaved persons. And that violence might be whipping, it might be binding somebody's hands and then dragging them behind a horse off to jail. It might be attacking them, sending the dogs after them. But the problem here is one of money. If you're a slave owner, if you're a white slave owner in the antebellum South, the slaves that are part of your property are just that, they're property. They have a monetary value. And if a slave gets attacked at night by a patrol group and is unable to work the next day, then you as the owner are deprived of their labor. You're deprived of your property's ability to work for however long it takes them to recover. And so it's the reason why patrols can't all be poor men is because that creates too great a risk to the folks who are the owners of slaves. There's the potential to have financial loss in terms of the lost working ability of a slave who's been beaten up or who's been maimed by a patrol group, because patrol groups have the right under the law to use violence.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that one of the things I was very interested to learn in the book is kind of this plantation, enslaver, white kind of ambivalence, but also pushback against the patrols. I was very fascinated to find out that there were plantation owners who wouldn't write passes out because they, for whatever reason, and didn't want the patrols on their property, and sought ways to get out of the patrol and all that kind of stuff. So maybe you could talk about
There were. It's actually not that hard to understand why there would be some plantation owners who rejected the idea of patrols. Patrols were effectively an arm of the state. They acted on the behalf of the local government or the state government. And what they're effectively saying, the existence of patrols effectively is a rebuke to a plantation owner. It effectively says, you can't control your own slaves. Therefore, the state's going to have to do it for you, or the local community is going to have to do it for you. And so there are plenty of plantation owners who reject that notion that they can't control their own slaves, that they don't know what their slaves are doing at all times. And on the other hand, there are some plantation owners who honestly and sincerely believe that slaves are a part of their family. Okay, now we can reject this as just kind of false consciousness taken to the nth degree in the modern world. But in that time, there actually were some people who were slave owners who did see the enslaved people who they owned as part of their family. And they did not want strangers intruding into that relationship. And so for a number of reasons, either because you might, as a slave owner, you might think that the existence of the patrol is effectively an insult because it's saying that you're unable to control your own slaves, or because you feel like it's an intervention that's unneeded. An enslaved person is part of the family. For those reasons, and for many others, there were lots of slave owners who did not like patrols, did not want patrols on their land, were quick to say, get off of my land, although they had no legal right to do so, and who objected to the existence of what the patrols required. There are a number of instances in the post-war narratives, in the post-war interviews that were done with former slaves, where they talk about having had a master who did not allow patrols to come on to the plantation that master owned, that they rejected them and they told them not to come. Whether or not those restrictions were honored or not is impossible really to tell.
Yeah, it was just an interesting fact that I found. It didn't strike me as something that would be intuitive when you think about it. But once you get into it, it's very fascinating. I kind of want to switch now to why the slave patrols were so necessary in the white mind. And I think speaking especially about kind of this fear of insurrection, rebellion, not to mention just the daily runaways and that kind of thing.
It can be difficult for people in our time to try to step into the shoes of white lawmakers from 250 or 350 years ago. But we have to try. We have to exercise our historical imagination to be able to make that leap and to try to think about, well, how did they view the world? In the early 1600s, when the first laws and the first slaves are coming to places like, say, South Carolina, the lawmakers there are concerned about control. It is about attempting to control individuals who they perceive as a threat to public order. Now, in that world, in the early 1600s, enslaved people are simply one of a number of different groups that are thought of as posing a threat to social order. Runaway debtors, sailors, people who are of no fixed abode, that is to say, folks who kind of wander in and wander out and who might be con men, confidence men, we might call them. And so there are a number of reasons why lawmakers tried to, in the early 1600s, put laws into place that would control these, what I describe as marginalized groups that white lawmakers viewed as a threat to order or a threat to society. And once those laws are put into place, they get refined and refined and refined a little bit more. But the anxiety of trying to control these groups never really goes away. If you look, for example, at laws from the early 1700s. There are laws on the books that say that whites shouldn't be handing guns to Native Americans. Well, why? Because they might turn around and use them. There are laws in the 1700s that talk about how every ship captain should check the papers of any individual who's getting on their ship because they might be a runaway debtor. And so there are a lot of people who we might think of as, stretching those societal bounds and in ways that enslaved people are simply part of this. They're not unusual. They're part of the reason why laws exist to try to control people. And there are a lot of laws that exist to control people. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see how the earliest slave rebellions would be logical. If you were enslaved, you'd want freedom too. And also create a great threat, pose a new kind of psychological threat to white lawmakers who are trying to control all these different groups. The earliest reports we've got of any kinds of uprisings are from the 1600s in South Carolina. There are plenty of instances where individuals who were enslaved didn't want to be. And in some cases, they were still only one generation. They might have been taken from Africa, and so they might still have knowledge that they had from Africa. Many Africans had experience in warfare and were accustomed to using weapons. So it's not a surprise that they might take up weapons. They might try to use them. And so this is the reason why ultimately South Carolina's militia morphs into and divides into having a militia and a patrol. So insurrections are there from the very beginning. That's what I'm really, the overview I'm trying to provide here is to just say, we might think of insurrections as things that might be more common later. They're common from the beginning. From the very first moment that an enslaved person is brought against their will to North America, there's the potential for an insurrection. Any kind of person seeking their own freedom, whether it's individually as a runaway or collectively as a body that's trying to revolt, would pose a threat to the whites who are making laws. And so what's really kind of fascinating is that for a time, some threats to the social order are viewed as a greater threat than the enslaved people are. That is to say, in the 1720s and early 1730s, South Carolina mandates that the militia has to train enslaved people, has to train them and provide weaponry for them, because at that point, white lawmakers are more afraid of Native Americans than they are of the enslaved people who might be part of their militia. Now, those laws are taken off the books after just barely a decade in the 1730s. And one of the great rebellions in South Carolina's history, the Stono Rebellion of 1739, may well come out of the fact that some of these enslaved individuals had been given, if they didn't already know, given military training and getting them accustomed to using weapons. And certainly it's after that time that South Carolina really begins to write stern laws to try to enforce all of the patroller regulations to try to keep a real tight control on all of the people who are enslaved. I keep talking about the patrols and the militia, and we'll go back to that point about insurrections in a moment, but I just want to make sure that your listeners understand that it wasn't just the militia that served as the basis of patrols. In North Carolina, patrols grew out of tax lists. County courts in North Carolina used the tax roster to basically choose who their patrols would be, and there was no connection to the militia at all. But anyway, to go back to your question about insurrections, revolts and uprisings were commonplace through every century as long as slavery existed. We could talk about revolts like Stono. We could talk about Gabriel's Rebellion, the first and second uprising in the late 1790s in Richmond, Virginia. But they're everywhere. They happened any place where enslaved people thought that they might be able to take advantage of the situation and gain the upper hand. The Vesey Rebellion in 1822 in Charleston, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Southampton, Virginia. All of these are examples of kind of the biggest examples of what's kind of a long-term simmering threat to the continued existence of slavery as an institution across the South.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I read about these insurrections and kind of the response was that there was this renewed, so after insurrection, may not have been local, but the news of it spread, like Nat Turner's, there was this great swell of people wanting to, like the slave patrol became very rich and robust in its policing, for lack of a better word, but then eventually it kind of petered out again, and it didn't really formulate into a.
This is an ongoing and repetitive pattern in the story of slave patrols, and you're right to use the word policing. A lot of the activities that they engaged in, a lot of the words that are associated with the work that they did, patrollers worked on a beat. They patrolled a geographic zone in their county that was referred to as a beat in South Carolina. These are things that we connect with policing for obvious reasons. But generally speaking, the work of slave patrols was one that had a kind of a curve of activity that would go downward. They might become less and less active until there's a threat of rebellion, and then it spikes up. And this is in the nature of work that one can imagine would have posed a real hardship for the individuals who were required to do it. I mean, certainly nothing compared to the hardship of being an enslaved person. But if you think about it, the people who are called upon to be slave patrols, they've already worked a full day. They've already put in a full day's work on their farm or in their shop, wherever it is that they might be working. And now they're being sent out to do the work at night. Most slave patrol work was done at night. And so this would be like, okay, fine, you've done a 8-hour shift. You've already been up for 12 hours, and now you're called upon to do another 8-hour shift on top of that. And so it's not surprising that there are stories about patrols caught napping, patrols caught drinking or carousing while on duty, patrols not being active enough, meaning going out enough nights during the week or during the month. And there were repetitive calls for them to be more active, but those would escalate tremendously in the wake of an actual revolt or insurrection, any kind of rebellion or rebellious activity on the part of enslaved people. And suddenly the amount of work the patrols are doing, how much they're doing, skyrockets. Now, part of the reason why the down curve is, it's not just about individual patrollers, it's also about money. Patrols were going to be paid one way or another. They're either paid through a direct compensation, as in North Carolina, or they're paid in the 1730s, and for a brief time in Virginia, they were also paid, but they're also paid indirectly through tax subventions. Effectively, you get a break on your tax at the end of the year for the local area if you're a patroller for a given period of time. And so putting more patrols out there means more money. And that means that the community has to come up with more money. It means taxes go up. And so part of the reason why patrol activity might be allowed to get kind of, loose or slack or whatever word you might want to use is because to make it run at a more kind of effective, efficiency level is also comes with monetary costs attached.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm going to shift gears now to another form of rebellion, which is the Confederacy leaving, rebelling against the Union. What happened to not only slavery, but also what happened to the slave patrols during the Confederacy, because they tried to maintain it.
Well, when the Confederacy takes form, the first state to secede is South Carolina, and it does so in late 1860, and the next six states to secede go in early 1861, before Fort Sumter, before any combat had actually taken place, and then the remainder leave after Fort Sumter and actual military conflict. But once those states leave and form the Confederacy, of course, they're the place where the most enslaved people happen to live. Now, it's not exclusive, because, of course, some states never join the Confederacy and continue to have slavery, Delaware and Maryland, for example. But in places where there's a very large enslaved population, the Confederacy and the state governments also face a real problem. They have to come up with an army to fight for effectively the freedom of their nation, as they would put it, at the same time that they need to leave some people who are white and armed behind in all of these little towns and villages where enslaved people are. And so they're effectively, we're back to that problem of the militia might be sent off to face the pirates or the Native Americans. You leave the patrollers behind. It's the same sort of difficulty, only now on a much grander scale. They face the might of the Union Army, which could attack basically anywhere. And at the same time, they need to continue to provide, the violent control of and supervision over their own enslaved people. So at the beginning, there's not much problem, in part because at the very outset in 1861, the Confederacy gets more volunteers than it has uniforms to fill. Literally, they don't have the supplies that would enable them to put everybody into an army. Same thing's true in the North. The Army up to that point nationally had been very small. And so there's just they're not the supplies. And so for at least the beginning of the war in 1861, there's really not much change. In the South, there are a lot of people who are terrified that the election of Lincoln means that the enslaved people will rise up and immediately attack their white owners. Nothing happens. It's the big non-event of 1861. But in fairly short order, the Confederacy runs into a manpower problem, and they are going to, along with the North, begin to turn to conscription, that is to say a draft, in 1862 and in 1863. And at first, there are no exceptions for slave owners. They're to be drafted just like everybody else. However, in turn, the government puts in an exception clause that allows any white slave owner who owns 20 or more enslaved individuals an exemption. And it grants them that exemption, the theory being, of course, that they need to stay back and maintain supervision over those individuals. And this created a lot of anger and resentment among people in the South who were not slave owners. It's a difficult thing for us to keep in mind, but 3/4 of the American South were not slave owners. The slave owning population was only 1/4 of the total white Southern population at the time the war began. And so if those individuals, if a significant portion, let's say 1/8 of the population is getting a break from conscription, it's not surprising that the remaining 3/4 or 7/8 are going to be really hacked off. That their brother, father, son, or themselves is getting conscripted into the army, and these individuals who own slaves are not. And so this is what led to the phrase, the rich man's war, poor man's fight. But even with exemptions that were permitted for individuals to stay behind and provide supervision for enslaved people, it's just not enough. There are too many white men who have been permanently extracted out of the community, not just for a month hitch in the militia, but now for months and years at a time, that it would be surprising if there was not a greater restlessness, unease, fear of what enslaved people might do. And there's certainly a greater ratcheting up of white anxiety as time goes by during the Civil War, that the slaves are going to rise up, that they're going to do something. There are no real reports of anything like that. And one of the things that I didn't talk about in the book, because frankly, it didn't occur to me when I was writing it, is that it may have been, in fact, the presence of the invalided soldiers who were sent home, who provided some sense of that greater security and that oversight to enslaved people. Because the total number of people who end up not as mortalities, not as death toll, but as people who suffer, let's say, the loss of an arm or a leg, they get sent home, and it's they plus the people who are not eligible for the draft, people who are over the age of 60, people who are under the age of 16, who are then going to be called upon to try to continue to provide supervision through the patrols. And this is what carries patrols through to the end of the Civil War. They're pretty much a shell of their earlier self, but there's certainly enough white anxiety out there to make sure that they're still doing their job.
Well, yeah, and white anxiety is what I wanted to talk about next, because after the Civil War, the slave patrol obviously can't continue. There are no longer slaves, but it morphs into what we would mostly what we think of now as the Klu Klux Klan, and kind of how that and I would kind of like to focus on how the tactics between slave patrols and the White Terror post-war, how that kind of shifted.
Sure. In the post-war period, the people who had been patrols obviously now cannot perform that same function in society. Slavery has been outlawed, thank goodness, by the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. But of course, in the South, the 14th Amendment is going to be ignored pretty widely. And indeed, what you have in the wake of the Civil War, when patrols no longer can officially take action, you have a kind of a bifurcation. You have a division of what patrol work had been like before the war took place. The sort of surveillance, let's watch where stolen goods go, stuff like that, that ends up falling under the heading of the work that police will do. But the stuff that has to do with terror and intimidation and racial control, that's going to fall under the purview of the Klan. And I should say there's a lot of overlap there. It's not as if The police are are not intending to try to do some kind of racial control. They are. It's just that there is a little bit more constraint upon what they're permitted to do, whereas with the Klan, there's no constraint at all. A long time ago, I came up with a description to try to explain who the patrols were to folks who had never heard about them before. And I said, have you heard of the Ku Klux Klan? I was like, yeah, right. I said, the patrols are the Klan without the sheets. They are effectively the Klan's use of physical intimidation, violence, the threat of violence against buildings, against people, against schools, churches, any kind of evidence of what we might think of as African American solidarity or advancement, whether that be through education or banking or religious buildings. All of those things are going to come under threat, and any sort of behavior by men, women, or children who are African American is going to be scrutinized. And if whites in the community don't like it, they're going to be threatened and physically harmed, if not killed outright. The Klan is not where lynching begins in this country, but the Klan becomes closely associated with lynching in this country. And for the better part of the next century, off and on, we're going to see lynching that takes place that's racially motivated, and it has to do with attempts by white locals to control what African Americans do or don't do in society. And so there's a pretty strong overlap between what patrols do and what the Klan ends up becoming. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that some of the patrol work also ends up with what the police do, and that racial control, certainly in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, is certainly part of what the police were about in that time period as well.
When I was really struck by this distinction that you touched on just now, but it kind of really drove home in the book, is that, post-war, that constraint on what the patrol could do to an African American was because they were someone else's property. And then after the war, murder is really just skyrockets.
Absolutely. This is actually what was the tip off to me about why are there slave owners serving on patrols? Well, they're effectively like the brakes, if you will, on what might otherwise be a runaway car. If you imagine yourself into the mind of someone who is not a slave owner, who's put on to slave patrol duty because you got your name got pulled, or you were the one who your record got pulled and the court put you on, you might have no sympathy whatsoever towards either slaves or their owners. And you might be the first person in line to say, let's just shoot him. And that sounds crude, but that's the reason why the slave owners were part of the patrollers, was to prevent that sort of going off the rails behavior by people who otherwise would have no reason to stop. And those breaks are gone in the post-war period. There's no property angle in African Americans. Indeed, there's a negative, a strongly negative incentive. If that individual owns land that you want, if they have crops that you want, if they have something else that you want, then of course you're going to use all the violence in the world to try to get it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great distinction, because during the slavery, they were primarily labor. But after slavery, African Americans started owning things that suddenly threatened not only just the system of white supremacy, but also the economics of white supremacy.
That's right.
Different form of economics, I guess. So
we have to use our historical imagination, put on our thinking cap, and try to think, well, what would it have been like? And once we do that, and some of the shoes we're stepping into are a very deeply unpleasant people. But if we can step into their shoes, then we can see what are their incentives, what are their motivations, as well as what are the things that are stopping them from taking action.
Yeah, that's, your work's incredibly important and really well done. And I would just kind of like to give you an opportunity to, if you have any final thoughts on slave patrols, or, you kind of touched on the police. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
I'll say just a moment. I'll say just a little bit here, and that is, it's something that I put into the introduction, actually, of the book. When this was written, and the bulk of it was written in the early 1990s, it was in the wake of the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I wrote was to say, if we want to try to figure out where the police came from and where racial violence or racial profiling came from and connected to the police, then we might look for the roots of that in something like the work of the slave patrols. But at the same time, if we use that as the only reason, then it's effectively getting us off the hook for the hard work. We're the people who are alive now. The guys I write about, they're long dead. They're long gone. And yeah, some of them, the patrols were horrible, horrible racists. But if we blame them for the kind of society we've got now, then we're effectively giving a pass to all of the folks who are alive now who could change our society for the better. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of the folks who are interested in this work to remember that the work is ours. We're the ones who are alive now. And if we want to change the way that the races interact or the way that African Americans are treated by the police in our world, it's up to us to make that happen.